Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Kat Moss. Kat was previously on the podcast where we discussed the counter movement jump rebound, and the squat jump. Today we're going to be diving into isometric testing, free run settings on force plates, in addition to a number of other different application points for using force plates in a clinical setting. Again, my conversations with Kat really helped to mold and shape the way that I use force plates for myself clinically, and I highly recommend using these. And I highly recommend listening to these and using them as a great reference point to better understand how to use and apply force plates and testing in your clinical setting. Episodes like this are made possible by our sponsors, IsoFit and Oro Muscles. IsoFit is my go-to for all things relating to isometric strength training, and Oro Muscles is my go-to for an actionable wearable device to help better understand what's going on under the hood, so to speak, for my athletes. For more on IsoFit and Oro, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Kat, welcome back to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you again. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me back. Happy to be here.
So, if people haven't listened to that first episode yet, where we kind of broke down CMJ, squat jump, or, basically non-counter movement jump, and CMJ rebound, I highly recommend they go back and listen to it. But in case they haven't and they're just tuning in for this one, would you mind reminding people about who you are and all the amazing things that you and Hawkins Dynamics and everyone is doing that way?
Yeah, so my role, Hawk Dynamics, I wear kind of a number of different hats at the company. I do anything from events to the person that does your onboarding, and then I also manage some of our kind of accounts in general. But yeah, us Hawk Dynamics, we specialize in our force plates, but we also have our true strength unit that just came out as well, which is more of an isometric, so it's an affixed dynamometer. Kind of anything force assessment, we're the ones for you.
You already said my favorite word, isometric. I feel like that's like the majority of what I do sometimes. And it's so interesting because I feel like isometrics in general are very undertrained, but also underappreciated from a testing standpoint that way. And I think that we can get a lot of valuable data and insight from testing isometrically. And like you mentioned, obviously you can do ISOs on the plates, but you can also use the true strength device that way to measure isometrically as well. From your end, why should people even bother to test isometrically? Like, what's the benefit to being able to test an isometric force for someone?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, isometric test is like gives you a maximal strength metrics. So obviously, from other force plate assessments or even general just like strength training, you can test like a max doing squats, for example. But using isometric test, it's a good way to find out maximal strength in like a standardized, repeatable environment. And so, especially in an environment where college setting, for example, like obviously there is importance and value to, hey, can you back squat or front squat X and whatever, and that's has its value. But having a test that you can do over and over again the exact same way with the same sort of outputs that you can compare time over time again, and also the safer way to do it. That's kind of where isometrics come into play. But isometrics can also be valuable from like a return to play standpoint. So like, do you actually have the strength to return back to sport? Or even as you get into more specific settings. So think of like overhead sports. So baseball, volleyball, kind of first few that come to head where they're super oriented on the upper body. Being able to test just single limb strength is important for either flagging an injury that might happen, or also either return to play, or even just monitoring. Like isometrics can be used as a monitoring tool over time. Obviously, they're more of a maximal test traditionally, but like you said, they're kind of underutilized in training. So you can use isometric testing sub-maximally in a lot of different settings.
That opens up a huge conversation, especially you mentioned on the return to sport, return to play side of things, and even the monitoring side of things. I mean, plain and simple, for all of my ACLs, we're doing some kind of isometric knee extensor test that way, usually at two different angles, 90 degrees and 60 degrees tend to be the two that I like most. Obviously, we can test hamstrings as well and get a isometric hamstring to quad ratio, but I think that that kind of actual strength metric is so essential in the post-op knee ACL population in particular. And that's something I use clinically with every single ACL that walks in the door is, I want them all to hit a 3.0 torque to body weight ratio when we do that kind of testing that way. And they're all doing it at least monthly, starting at around the 4 month mark. So we definitely put a lot of stock into that clinically. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the unique things I've noticed about your true strength device compared to other dynamometers is the sense that you can like push into it or pull it apart. So you can actually get like adduction abduction ratio or abduction adduction ratio at the hip really, really easily. And I think that makes a great conversation on the hip return to play side of things. And I think that when we look at hip from a rehab standpoint, a lot of times we kind of look at it and we're like, well, it's strong enough, I guess, and we don't know how to test it, but this makes it really freaking easy to test it, for lack of a better way to put it. And on top of that, from a load monitoring standpoint, I think in general, having the ability to assess those metrics, even if it's just preseason, postseason, or, once a month in season or something like that, that way, I think that it can really open the door to conversations about why things are changing in season. Are we doing too much? Are our athletes not recovering enough and that sort of thing? And it's like, if I expect my post-op ACLs to hit a 3.0 torque to body weight ratio in order to be cleared to go back to sport, but I have an athlete at the start of the season who's not even at a 1.5. I kind of have to look at that and consider like, hey, should I beef up the quad a little bit more before we get to the season that way, and kind of understand, how those metrics apply to, what potential things could happen down the road.
Yeah, no, 100%. And say, like you mentioned, like having it specifically for like a return to play and like the true strength, for example, like obviously you can push, pull on it. Because ours, you can also like fix it to a rack, kind of talking about like that standardization. It's a test that you could do over and over again. So through that like return to play process, you could actually, hey, we're setting up this exact same way. And actually new to the true strength, we have it is that there's actually a target force that you can set on the true strength. So you could use it, hey, for rehab, we want you to hit X newtons. Or, in theory, hopefully, if you've done testing before someone might be injured, hey, we know your max force, your peak force that you hit. Okay, here, let's hit like 50% of that. Or if you're training, set that target force. Okay, we want to do a rep at 50, 75, 80% of the max. And then like I said, so like you mentioned like hamstring testing. So you can do hamstring on like the force plates as well as on the true strength. And true strength obviously hopefully will make it a little bit easier. On the force plates, it's kind of cool. So you can set up a few different ways. So you mentioned kind of the few different angles that you used. There's a few different like hamstring tests that you can do, a 90, 30, 60, kind of etc. there. So there's so much like with isometrics, there's so much versatility that you can do with isometric testing, which I think is pretty cool.
Exactly. I completely agree. And the other piece to it as well is understanding, the multiple muscles that play a role in any kind of joint movement that way. So, you mentioned hamstrings that way. So typically people measure that via knee flexion. Well, knee flexion is a great way to measure the muscles that flex the knee, but the hamstrings aren't the only ones that do that. The gastrocs have a small contribution. The sartorius has a small contribution. The gracilis has a small contribution. And all those little things may or may not matter in the grand scheme of things, but it's one of those things where I think we have to acknowledge that there's more than meets the eye, and maybe we can actually position someone in a way that biases part of that over others. So, for example, one of the things that I notice in the ACL world, in the post-op hamstring graft population in particular, is knee rotation kind of gets a little bit wonky, for lack of a better way to put it, because they tend to pull from muscles that internally rotate the knee to create the new graft. So if that's the case, then if I could isometrically test hamstring or knee flexion, I should say, in an internally rotated versus externally rotated position and just see how that changes things, I think that there's value in that and understanding things on that deeper level. And I think that that's an area where having some kind of dynamometer load cell like the True Strength could really enter in the conversation that way on the return to sport side of things as well, is understanding how to apply it on that deeper conceptual level and understanding that you can get a lot more data than just like an isolated test that may or may not be actually testing the hamstrings in the first place.
Yeah, I say that's probably one of the caveats with isometric testing is that you can test lofts in a number of different angles, or whatever, but like, are you actually truly testing what you want to? Because whatever, or part of your hip because of how you're set up. So that's something within isometric testing we always kind of like cue people of like make sure when you're setting up your isometric test that you're actually doing it in a correct kinematic way that you're actually testing what you're testing. Because sometimes, people are like, oh, well, I wanted to do, a single like calf isometric, but like how they're positioned. Oh, are you actually using more of, maybe your quad or your hamstring because you're not actually truly just push off your calf, like you're fully using your hip. So that's kind of caveat with isometric testing is standardizing a protocol that's actually correct.
When it comes to setup for isometric tests that way, whether it's shoulder, hip, knee, you mentioned ankle and calf that way, what kind of like positions or protocols, what kind of approaches do you find people applying most consistently with good results that way? Or how do you recommend individuals set up for some of these different isometric tests?
Yeah, no, 100%. So, I mean, kind of like the major ones, mid-thigh pull, belt squat, ash test are kind of the three big ones that most often people are testing. So, for like a mid-thigh pull, like it's like the second position of like a hang clean, for example. So, something to kind of consider with like a belt squat and an mid-thigh pull is obviously as you're testing a whole kind of group of athletes, everyone's going to be different heights. So, like line up all your athletes according to height, especially like hip height, for example, and then kind of go about that way. So like kind of something we use with like a belt squat is we actually taped chain links, different colors. So an athlete, okay, you're red, you're green, you're blue, you're white, and that kind of helps standardize. So there's basically the kind of second position for a hang clean pull, for what your knee angle should be at for both a mid-thigh pull and a belt squat. And something to also consider is lots of times is you want to be able to take the tension out of the bar or out of the chain, especially with that mid-thigh pull or the belt squat. So take the tension out of the bar, test starts, and when the test actually begins, you want to continue to press up or continue to pull. So how kind of a fail test kind of occurs in isometric test or not a good test is if you see a spike in the force before they actually hit peak force. So they'll spike, they'll go down, and then the force will kind of climb up. And that's basically because you don't take the tension out of the chain or the bar in the mid-thigh pull or the belt squat. So always kind of coming up with a take the tension out. It's kind of a two-step thing. So it's kind of like take the pre-tension out. And then same thing for the ash. On the opposite side, people sometimes don't apply enough force. So having kind of a base force that you press down on the force plates or with the true strength actually be a lot easier because it's a little bit more sensitive and just the location of it will make it a lot easier to do upper body assessments in general. But having a pre-tension, so kind of like that quiet phase that you think of in a CMJ or any of the jump tests, having a base force, basically a quiet force or holding phase is important to get a baseline and then have like upwards from there.
It's interesting too, as you were talking about the shape of the graph that way, because I know that was something that came up in the CMJ conversation that we had earlier. Was it's not just about the jump, it's about what does the graph actually look like and what does the normal graph look like. And it sounds like from what you're saying about taking up the tension or taking up the slack first, we should kind of see almost like a plateauing occur where we see that spike kind of levels off. It might go up a little bit more, it might kind of waver up and down a little bit, and then it's probably going to drop off at the end that way, or that's typically what I've seen that way. And it's interesting because I see that pretty consistently, whether it's on the plates or some kind of load cell that way is people climb, they climb, they climb, and then it kind of flutters a little bit. They get up, they go down a little bit, and then they drop down at the end that way. So I think that having that understanding of what your graph or what your data metrics should look like is really important in this conversation as well. So you mentioned the ash for shoulder, you mentioned the belt squat, you mentioned the isometric mid thigh pull, and you mentioned that both the belt squat and the thigh pull are tested in kind of like that second position that you would see for a clean type of exercise that way. Have there been any other like commonly used isometric tests that you see set up on the plates that way, whether that's some kind of isometric squat assessment or calf raise assessment, or is there anything else that you really feel is standardized enough and fits a framework really well for application in the sports performance and rehab world?
I mean, obviously people love like doing isometric squats. So that's something that you can set up, within a rack or something doing just either using it as kind of a part of a training protocol or again, kind of I mentioned kind of like testing, maximal strength. Obviously, having a back squat maximal strength has a lot of value to it, but people also do maximal just like back squat pushes. A calf, there's kind of a few different ways that are out there to test calf isometrics. There's more of like a standing position where your back's up on the bar like you would for a back squat, but there's also kind of a half kneeling position that John McMahon has done some work with as well. So that's gained some traction. And then obviously hamstring, that's kind of everyone, really wants to test hamstring. And obviously there's a few different ways, doing a 90 position where you're laying on your back. That's a one that has some traction behind it as well. So those are probably the most common ones. And even with the Ash, there's kind of the I, Y, and T. So there's kind of the three different positions that you can do that in. And then kind of like outside of force plates, it's like I keep mentioning back to true strength, but it's isometric, so gotta touch on it. But you can now kind of test like internal external rotation or adduction. So internal external rotation is probably the big ones that on the true strength will be super helpful, especially in a rehab, rotator cuff injuries. Like now you have a way to literally test those abilities come back from that.
Yeah, not just test them, but test them at multiple angles and multiple positions, right? You could do by the
Exactly.
side, you could do up at a 90-90 of the shoulder, you could do
Right.
all the way up overhead and kind of seeing how strength changes in different positions that way. And on the hamstring, you mentioned the 90-90, and obviously with something like the true strength, it's very easy to adjust that angle to, a 75, a 60, a 30-degree, whatever that way. And like I mentioned before, you can play with the rotational element of that as well. And I mean, to me, that just makes a lot more sense as a test of knee flexion and knee flexor torque. On this concept of isometric testing, too, I get this question a lot of how long or how hard should people pull, and how you should cue that. And I think typically I see you mostly doing like 6 to 8 second pulls for the most part. Is that kind of the general duration that you recommend for people? And if so, why that duration? Or would there be any benefit to changing the duration otherwise?
Yeah, anywhere from like probably like 5 to 8 seconds is a standardized protocol that I've always followed and seen that everyone else has also done. That's kind of just like what's become the standard as well. And again, isometrics, because you can use them as a training tool, become you can kind of modify them for more specific sport oriented sort of things. That amount of time basically allows you to get peak force. Are they able to sustain it for that amount of time? Well, also be able to do a couple of different bouts. I have a theory if you're doing a maximal isometric test, you beyond 5 or 6 seconds, that's max fatigue there. So if you try to get two tests in after that, you can't really hit that maximal effort after that. So if you once maximal for 10 seconds, you probably have to do one test as well. So that's kind of the idea behind it as well. Hey, you can do multiple tests, a little bit of a break in between each rep there. Yeah, that's kind of the thing there. It's kind of become the norm because everyone just kind of done that.
And I think the other piece that I've heard a lot about lately, in fact, some of the PTs that we've just added to our clinic that way have been chirping me like crazy, like, dude, are you calculating dynamic strength index? And it's like, well, you kind of need to pair a jump and a ISO test together to get that DSI number. And I know that everyone's looking for kind of like those magic metrics and magic ratios that kind of pair a lot of things together and they can just look at one number that way. And obviously, I think DSI does that pretty well in the sense that, like I said, it pairs an isometric number, I believe a mid thigh pull with a jump number, and I believe that's the CMJ, correct?
Yep. So basically, it pulls peak force of CMJ and then peak force from an ISO. And within like the Hawkins system specifically, we have a report that actually pulls the peak force from wherever it occurs in the CMJ. So sometimes with the DSI, it's like, okay, but where does that peak force actually occur in a CMJ? Because it could occur in braking, propulsive, or at minimum displacement. The Hawkins system will actually pull it for you. So wherever it occurs, it'll pull that number for you. But yeah, the DSI can be a great option for like profiling individuals. Obviously, it kind of gives you a number of like, do they need more ballistic training or strength training? So if you are going to test it regularly, I think that's sometimes the caveat is that people will test it once, get a DSI value, and then like, all right. But like if you're actually going to train from it, like you said, hey, we're going to do testing every single month, then it's a value. Kind of like any metric, add a value to it. There's got to be more context behind that. So same thing with the ratio there.
Right, there has to be purpose behind the metric, what it is, and why you're assessing it that way. You brought up an interesting point on the force piece in the sense that sometimes it's hit propulsive, sometimes it's hit braking. What does that tell you about the athlete if they're hitting their peak force in a braking versus a propulsive phase that way?
Yeah, so basically different athletes and different type of athletes will hit peak force. Ideally, in an ideal world, you're hitting peak force right between braking and propulsive, right at minimum displacement. That happens sometimes, but certain athletes you actually want to favor more braking or propulsive. So there's a thing called braking impulse and propulsive impulse, which I think we mentioned briefly when we are talking about the CMJ. But you might hit peak force in either of those, and that just dependent on the athlete. Like a basketball player will probably hit peak force during the propulsive phase because they're a propulsive athlete, and that's actually probably a positive thing. A player or a sport that's more oriented towards braking is going to hit it in the braking phase. So it just more tells you about the type of athlete that you're dealing with.
Interesting. Yeah. And then from that, you can kind of like understand the demands of the sport, understand the metrics. So whether the sport is more of a braking or a propulsive force, like you gave the example of basketball there, and then kind of put those metrics as your key performance indicators. And then on the point that you made on the DSI that way, I feel like that one just kind of applies generally to almost every athlete that way because, I mean, every athlete should be strong isometrically, in my opinion. And every athlete should have the ability to produce force into the ground, whether it's for a propulsive or braking purpose, in my opinion. So I think that that kind of metric can kind of be applied almost to every sport. And then you can kind of bias the propulsive or the braking side of things on the CMJ more towards the, specific sport demands, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's exactly the case. Like, all right, take that DSI, like kind of like a lot of the metrics, hey, like improvements in that metric is gonna be a positive thing. If you're improving your peak force in a CMJ and also an isometric test, you can you can basically produce force in a maximal way and a submaximal way within like that CMJ in a more dynamic way. That's a positive thing and it can relate to sport.
I think that there's a whole conversation about like training with isometrics that could be had too with the incorporation of the force plates that way, because I found that the plates are great as a testing tool, but they also work really well as a training tool as well. I had a girl just the other day who we had a we did a couple tests. We did a CMJ rebound, and I think a mid thigh pull or something like that. But this individual has come to see me with, pain on one side of their body, as typically presents in the lower extremity that way in this case. And it was just so interesting to see how much weight she shifted away from that side on everything. So then it became the conversation of, hey, we're going to do this in real time. And we're going to kind of use the plates as more of like a neuro re-education training tool, if you will, to kind of like teach the body, hey, it's okay to actually put load through that other side when we move or when we pull, and use it as like a real-time feedback of where our weight is, but not only where our weight is as far as left versus right, the center of pressure map as well to see where on the foot we're actually putting pressure. Are we leaning too far forward? Are we in the heels where we are that way? And I found that that's a really valuable tool to kind of give athletes that real-time feedback about things because it might feel normal to them. And then we test it and it's like, well, you shifted almost all of your weight to that side. So I think that's something we should probably address.
Yeah, no, so using the free run setting kind of referred to with the center of pressure traces, like that's like a huge training tool because you can see the actual force traces, whether it's like, yeah, literally looking at the traces or the center of pressure. Because yeah, like I said, athletes might like, yeah, it hurts, but they don't realize how much they're shifting to one side. Like I actually like to do sometimes like my whole lift on the force plates with using like the center of pressure option or the free run option because it's kind of interesting. Like I'll do like a back squat and I'll do a front squat and I'm like, oh, on the front squat, I'm fine. And on the back squat, all of a sudden I shift my hip. And so like, oh, like what does that say about my training? And then you can toss in like a push-up, for example, and see how does that relate as well. So it can be used like across like you could do your whole lift on it if you wanted to. And I think using it as a biofeedback, not only in like that setting, like especially like a very beginning rehab setting, you could do as like anything from like starting off with like a balance test. Hey, when you're standing there on the plates, do you subconsciously just shift one side or the other? And then you could progress to like body weight squat. And then you could do even like a single leg balance. Like we've had some people that use it for like concussion testing because it will literally tell you how much you sway medial, lateral, anterior, posterior, and you could see percentage wise on a concussion test, obviously if they're swaying all over the place, and you have like a metric to draw it back to. But then, put some loaded squats up on there. So like we have, you know, weightlifters that will do their full sets on the force plates because it's like, oh, this is a training tool. You can do deadlifts on it. So like you would use it from like a variety of different methods and like see how during, hey, the top phase of my deadlift or when I put it down, like, oh, I dropped my leg and I didn't realize that.
Do I have to be concerned about how much weight someone's lifting if they're going to do it on the force plates?
No, it's like 3,000 pounds per plate. So like we've never had anyone like max it out. So like if you max it out, let me know. But no one's ever maxed it out. So we have like Olympic weightlifters that like use force plates and like professional powerlifters that use the plates. Never had a problem. Unless you're dropping the weight on it. No.
Yeah, that would be really difficult to do because usually the weight's way out to the side and the plates are right in the middle. But yeah, no, that's interesting on the like I'll call it virtually indestructible nature of the force plates that way. And as you were talking, my mind was going to all the different populations that I've seen that I'm like, man, I probably could have, should have, would have applied this a little bit earlier there. Especially you mentioned the concussion population there. And I think that it's very difficult for us to get good objective metrics in this population. And I know everyone's going to say, well, we can do this and we can do that. And, well, we had that balance test, but a lot of times we're observationally observing postural sway. And there's a
Right.
difference between seeing it with your eyes and actually seeing specific numbers and specific mappings that you can actually refer back to previously that way. I think that's something that can be very easily shared. Before we got on, we were talking about generating reports and sharing that amongst other providers easily that way. And I think that's an absolute game changer is not just having the ability to put numbers and assess things objectively, but actually being able to share that with everyone involved so that everyone can benefit from having the data, not just one clinician. Because a lot of the times when we're working with athletes, whether you're in a rehab setting, in a PT clinic or AT or Chiro or whatever that way, there's always multiple stakeholders involved or almost always multiple stakeholders involved. So the more easy we can like make it to get everyone on board, I think the better off we're going to be. And the other piece too, although I've said and kind of focus in the athlete world, this doesn't have to just apply to athletes, right? Like you could put
No,
grandma on
not
the
at all.
force plates and look at
Yeah.
balance there, and maybe pick up on things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. I think that while the performance side is super exciting, and as you're talking about using it with weightlifting and like different squat variations, like my mind thought of like 10 different things I want to go look at now. But it's like you could also do some really simple stuff with the older adult population here and have a great impact. And, again, on my point on athleticism and athletes that way, that term doesn't really have an age limit. So, if you've got a 75-year-old who goes out and plays pickleball and golfs 5 days a week, like throw them on the plates and see what there is to see.
Oh yeah, no, 100% say we actually have people, our plates are actually in hospitals and like you can do like a sit to stand test. That's a pretty simple test that's used a lot. See, throw them on the force plates, see what part of it that's they're struggling with. Or like so you mentioned golf, like we actually have some people that use the center of pressure for their swing. Same thing with like baseball. And then we actually have divers that use the center of pressure to replicate the first part of their dive, and they'll use that to correlate to their training, which is super interesting. But going back to kind of like the beyond like athletics population of like you could put the force plates, as like I said, like a balance thing, or like in the elderly population, they'll even just do like weight shifts. So like, hey, can you shift to your right side, shift to your left side, and just see also for like the patient seeing it in real time of like is that like I said, the very, very beginning return to play, or even that elder populations, like they'll have that you would have them in a retirement home and basically use it as a way for people to like be aware of their body, like body awareness. Like obviously that's something that as you get up into like the elderly population is that can be important is like proprioception. And so using it as a tool to kind of like help with that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And the other piece too, you kind of alluded to it, I think, is like when there's early post-op stages where you have a weight limit to how much you can put on one leg that way. Maybe it's, 50% weight bearing. That's all well and good, but what is 50% weight bearing? What
Yeah.
does that feel like to people? What does that look like? And if you don't have a way to assess that in real time, you're ultimately just having them guess at that. And that's something that I don't really get comfortable with myself, as far as the post-op population. Like, I don't want to mess up a surgery that someone just had by having them put more weight than they should on it. So having that ability to measure that is essential in my opinion that way. And I think the other piece too with the free run stuff is there's a lot you could assess with that, right? You could obviously assess the sway, like how far someone's swaying. You could assess like the velocity of the sway, I believe, like how fast they're moving back and forth. But you can
Mhm.
also still get the force metrics like you would for all the other tests in those same free run kind of settings that way as well, I believe. So you can really, like, to me, the sky is the limit with this, and you're only really limited by your creativity and how you use that from a training and testing standpoint, I think.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, so you get your average and peak forces and then yeah, velocity, sway. Like I said, the sky really is the limit. Like we kind of say, like you test anything you want on them. Like if you're putting force into the plates, then you can test it. So we have like chiropractors that have the plates, and we'll use it like after an adjustment. And so like really like if with our tagging capabilities, you can tag and create kind of like your own test type. So I said that goes along with like we mentioned like the ASH test and isometric. Sometimes people will do ASH test within the free run as like a multi-rep sort of use as well. And like going back to like the true strength, there's now the ability to kind of test multiple reps in a row. So, but people will use the free run to test like multiple reps of more of an isometric sway on it, if that makes sense. Isometric twist onto that free run option. So kind of referring to it as that training tool.
The other thought that came to mind as you were talking was, I mentioned earlier how I used this plates the other day with someone who was shifting most of their weight to their away from their involved side, I should say. They're
Mhm.
shifting away from their involved side, which obviously we expect that. But I guess I wonder to a certain extent what level of that sway side to side is normal during some of these movements because while I think everyone always assumes, well, it's going to be a perfect even 50-50 split all the time, I don't think that's ever really the true actionable case or the true clinical case for anyone that way. So, as far as that sway side to side goes with double leg movements or balance that way, are there any kind of like normal defined limits or anything along those lines, or even in like the squat movement that way? Is it like, hey, you're shifting a little bit as you squat, but that's okay because it's within this range? Like, we kind of consider that normal.
I honestly don't have a number for you for like how much a normal sway is, but kind of talking about like shapes, like obviously with the free run, you basically get the sway traces. And so there's obviously a normal kind of like trace that you'll get kind of front to back as you're going through movement. So using, bodyweight squats or any squats as an example, there's a normal just weight shift of like, heel to toe that you go through kinematically through a squat, and that's normal. It's kind of abnormalities in that trace. So on your right side, do you have a larger sway than you do on your opposite side? So comparing those actual traces rather than the number, because that's going to kind of shift person to person, those abnormalities is going to be what's going to be kind of a key indicator there. And like those force traces also like maybe obviously they're set up ideally you're in the middle of the plates, but maybe especially for a rehab, like sometimes maybe you're kind of like shifting hip to the right. So those traces might go, an oblong direction. So it's more like the looking at them kind of beyond the metrics as well.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Going back to what we talked about earlier with the shape that way is I think we said this probably a dozen times in the first podcast that way about how easy it is to get lost in the world of metrics and how many of them there are that way. And I think that some of them have a ton of value, and there's some of them that I still don't know the definition of or anything about them. But I think having that understanding of what the graph should look like that way is really essential that way. Another example of that was I had an athlete today. We were doing a single counter movement jump test, and he decided to do two counter movement jumps. So believe it or not, it didn't look like I thought it was going to because we did two instead of one as the test was kind of cutting off at that 6 second mark that way. So I think that that concept of understanding what normal looks like and what normal doesn't look like, and to a certain extent, I think you can like look at pictures and like read about it and pick it up in a textbook, but I also think that there's almost like a coach's eye side to this as well, where it's like, hey, you just test a couple hundred athletes and now you kind of get a sense of what that normalcy should look like based on your own experience.
Right. And so like the force plates are a tool to help. They're an objective tool to help the coach's eye, exactly. So in a bodyweight squat or a loaded squat, for example, again, you know what a good squat should look like. Obviously, using this data as well. Hey, maybe you don't realize you're shifting your hip during a squat. So maybe it's a good squat, but this can be, in addition to that, and like still keeping it simple though. You don't have to, get lost in the sauce of the metrics as well. So even for like the free run, there's still a number of metrics. And even for the isometric test, there's like 16 metrics. Choose like two or three, and go with that because you as a coach, know it should be right. But having a few metrics, not all of them to look at, is what's going to make it the key there.
I completely agree. And the other piece, as we were talking about the free run, I keep getting all these like, oh wow, think of that, think of that. At the end of the day, I know everyone wants to get stronger, they want to get faster, they want to get more explosive. All of those things come back to force at the end of the day, force into the ground, right? If you're going to squat 315 instead of 135, that requires your muscles to exert a higher level of force. So I could see
Right.
a lot of potential with the plates as far as looking into how to look at different movements or different metrics or different things that you do in your training side of things and actually look at the force into the ground within them and then kind of find the exercises that allow you to hit the forces that you want to achieve, whether that's high force or fast forces or whatever it looks like that way, whatever kind of force you want to develop in your athlete. Look at the kind of exercises in your programming that way and kind of say, hey, look, am I achieving this with what I'm doing, right? Like I might pick
Right.
the back squat, 3 rep max as a high force exercise, and then find that a 5 rep max trap bar deadlift, for example, actually gives us more force into the ground. So understanding that if my goal is to actually just train the athlete at high forces, I might not be programming them correctly in order to do that. And I think that having the ability to kind of like free run test all the exercises and the programming that you do and actually look at that force into the ground is a different way to think about the programming. And I think that that's kind of like a potential evolution for strength training as opposed to just progressing people based on weight on the bar.
Yeah, no, I mean 100%. Like I said, it's like it's another training tool, It's just like a trap bar and a barbell, like it's just like another training tool. So like incorporate it into your training, so make it just part of your training. Like we have a few universities that actually have the force plates embedded into the floor of their weight room. So like anything you do, yep, you're just also on the force plates. So you can just like, all right, you squatted this and your force was this. So you can basically use them as just like another layer.
Has there been any like unique or cool applications of the force plates that you've seen that you're just like, wow, I didn't think of that, whether it's from a testing side or a training side or something that just wasn't really like, you know, developed from the research and someone just kind of came up with that coach's eye kind of side of things and you're like, wow, that's really freaking cool.
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned earlier, but like I said, we have some like elite divers that will
Mhm.
use the free run as the first part of their approach, and they'll use that to correlate to, are we doing this correctly or am I actually like going off of the correct foot and like improvements in like force off of X foot. In theory, like, like I said, more force into the ground, you can jump higher. So for like in diving, more force off that foot, you can probably get higher off of the board. And that's just kind of one that was like, what? Like, no way. And so we have like baseball and golf that will use it to test to make sure they're like shifting their weight correctly. And I'm not a golfer, so I don't know the correct way that you're supposed to, shift your hips, but they'll use that in correlation with having a live feedback or like a virtual reality of like doing a swing and seeing how that correlates with how you shift your weight differently. So like the free run, like it's like sky's the limit, but like incorporating it into like other tech, let's say like VR and stuff is like kind of crazy, but it's awesome.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I've really enjoyed playing around with these from a like test retest standpoint as well. And it's something that I think now that we're talking about it, I don't just want to measure the test and the retest from like a jump or a thigh pull or whatever that way, but I'm kind of interested to kind of run the free metric data on that kind of like intervention that I'm testing, so to speak, just to see more about what we're actually doing from it. And I think that's, again, part of that conversation we've been having on the application to strength side of things is just having a deeper understanding of what you're actually doing with the exercise or the interventions you're doing and what effect it's having on the person in front of you. Because, we look at the research and we think we know what we're doing, but every individual responds a little bit differently to those things. So I think it kind of gives us a new appreciation and understanding for how that person's going to respond and react to the stimulus we're applying to them.
Yeah, I mean, I was like you nailed it. Like using it as like way to like kind of check yourself, I think is super cool. And like it's even using it as a test retest. Like I saw that you had, did like a CMJ, did like an isometric, and then went back and did a CMJ. And so like kind of showing also I think like showing like athletes or thing of like, see, like this is why we do this training. Like that's how this is why we do it. So I think like using it as like a reinforcement tool is also kind of cool. Like I think especially athletes, they can be like, ah, oh, whatever, we're just doing this, but like being able to show someone, here's why we're doing it, and here's actually the effect that this is having, like that speaks bounds as well.
No, I completely agree. And I think, again, the deeper we get into understanding what we do and why we do, the better we're going to be at doing it, Kat. And I realize that you talk about force plates and true strength all day long, every day, and you just eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. And you could probably talk about it. We could probably talk about it for hours and hours that way. But, as we start to wrap up here, is there anything that we missed or anything we didn't cover in this conversation around isometric testing, different setups, different things to consider around ISOs, and then the ability to just free run and kind of test and intervene with anything and everything?
I think for like the isometric testing, we talk a lot about specific metrics. And again, like I said, you can kind of get lost in how many metrics you want to pull. Like pick like a few that again are like more specific to your sport. Like there's, time to peak force, relative peak force, and then like force at certain timestamps are always the ones I kind of like recommend. So like are we improving our max force? Are we improving how fast we get to that max force? And then also relative to body weight is always interesting to look at because you'll have this, tiny little athlete that actually produce more force than someone that's bigger. And you're like, what? But it's like, yeah, like they're relatively stronger. So like that can be something, especially as you have a large, diverse group of athletes to look at. And I think people kind of forget that, especially in considered isometrics of like body to body, like that force changes a lot. Like just because they're a bigger person doesn't actually mean relative to their body weight, they're strong. So that, general like weightlifting and weight training, they can maybe lift more, but actually relative to their body weight, are they actually stronger? So it's kind of something that like as you kind of get into isometrics more, that's something important to look at is like looking at the relative number. Like to themselves, are they actually improving their own strength? And then as far as the free run goes, really like the sky is the limit, but like kind of like any testing, like coming up with a standardization kind of goes with like isometric test and the free run, come up with those protocols that you can retest and test again. Obviously have fun with it, occasionally do something funny on it because that's, you can test really anything, and that's like the awesome part about them. But like the value in it does come in the ability to kind of the repeatability of those tests.
Definitely. And I think that's a great point. It's just having that framework set up for whatever you're doing that way and understanding what you're doing, why you're doing it, but how you're going to do it the same way the next time. Because if you do it different each time, you're going to get a different result every single time that way. So I think there's a great conversation, a great breakdown, and I always learn a ton anytime I talk with you, Kat, whether it's how to actually charge the force plates to understanding different metrics and how to actually apply them with the athletes that we serve that way. For people who want to find out more about you or they want to find out more about Hawkins, where can they find you all at?
Yeah, as always, hawkindynamics.com and hawkindynamics on X and on Instagram, best place to find information about us.
Awesome. We'll link to all that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there. Kat, this is awesome. I really appreciate your time.
Yep, always happy to chat.